Good morning and welcome to the WAVY Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be talking about Black History Month in the city of Hampton. So the Hampton History Museum is joining us today to share a little bit more about certain histories that you may know, you may not know, but it's a good opportunity to learn more about what is, the history of this area and join along. So I'm going to bring on our guests right now. We have Willow Pell here from the Hampton History Museum. Will, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you have a couple histories you're going to share with us today in the time that we have. I know that I'm sure you would say too, we could cover this obviously every day, which is what the museum is there for. So I would say just before we get started, if anyone wants to learn more, the History Museum, if you don't know, is a great resource. Could you just tell us a little bit about the museum before we jump in?
Yeah, so the Hampton History Museum, we obviously teach the history of Hampton. We're located at 120 Old Hampton Lane in downtown Hampton. And we teach 400 years of Hampton's history. So from the native people that lived here before English settlement all the way up to the 20th century. And I'll plug that we are constantly switching around our upstairs gallery. We've got a constantly changing gallery. So we have a new exhibit opening later this month. So be on the lookout for that.
Exciting. And I know that you all put in a ton of different exhibits, and it's a great place to go, obviously, to learn about local history, but some of these local histories are really significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as Black history goes, Hampton is a wealth of historical firsts and events with national and state significance from the first arrival of Africans in 1619 all the way up through the present day, through the Civil War with the contraband decision. So there's a lot of Black history to cover here at the museum.
And the first one that we wanted to talk about today is the Aberdeen Gardens neighborhood. And that's one that, while historic, is still here, it's still thriving. There's still a neighborhood. And I'm going to actually pull up some videos so people can see what it looks like today, but also some photos that you shared with us of what, it did look like historically as well. But if you just want to start and just tell us, some about this neighborhood.
Yeah, so like you said, Aberdeen Gardens is a currently existing and thriving historic neighborhood, but its origins go back to 1934. So talking about the midst of the Great Depression, the federal government had lots of programs aimed at those New Deal efforts to revitalize the economy, and part of that were a lot of resettlement efforts for lower class families. And dozens of these resettlement efforts took place across the United States. And one of them of particular significance was here in Hampton. Hampton Institute in 1934 submitted a request, a petition to the United States government, to the Resettlement Association, or RA, to create a homestead, a planned community here in Hampton that would cater to Black workers who were in what was considered substandard housing. And so Aberdeen Gardens came about as a result of that. And this was a significant project because it was the only one in the country at the time built by Black residents for Black residents that succeeded in that goal. Others across the United States, including one contemporary with Aberdeen called Swantown, had failed either because local white backlash had canceled the project or converted it into whites-only segregated housing. So Aberdeen Gardens, through the support of Hampton Institute, the RA, and the local community, managed to become this a project that was unlike any other in the country at the time and continues to be thriving today.
Thank you. Thanks for that history. And I just want to point out, sort of while we're going through this, there obviously is some historical markers or maps, if you go to the district that still exists today. In terms of the significance of this, do you think that people are familiar when they walk into the museum or they ask about these histories about Aberdeen Gardens? Do you think it has more of a local tie that people have heard about this? I know that WAVY did a report and we've done past reports, on this neighborhood, and last year during Black History Month, which is why we have some of this footage. But is it something that more people should know about, I guess, is what I'm really asking.
Yeah, I think in the local community, Aberdeen certainly has made its mark, but I think its significance in a national sense and in its first of its kind sort of place in the national story, and um, the story of how it came to be despite backlash and despite attempts to cancel the project, as so many had been before, are worth talking about and worth sharing. And I'd like to just share that the Aberdeen Gardens Historical Foundation and people like Margaret Wilson and other historians from that community have done an incredible job of retaining their own history and preserving it in the form of their own museum that is in one of the houses, the original houses that were built in the 30s, and spreading that into people, including me, teaching me about that history.
Absolutely. It's something that we've covered before, as I said, so I'll make sure to link that so that people can go back and see, from the neighborhood, actually, I think from some of these historians, the telling of some of these histories. And it's just, it's terrific that obviously it's preserved in a home for people to actually go see and go learn about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then, not to jump ahead, if there's anything else you want to share about Aberdeen Gardens neighborhood, and we can certainly jump back to that if anyone watching has any questions or wants to put anything in the chat. But the other conversation that we wanted to speak about was the Hampton Institute civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And then I actually am going to pull up some Hampton, video as well, just to show, what we're sort of covering.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a project that I had worked on several years ago. Was researching what happened here in Hampton during the Civil Rights Movement, and I found through the newspaper reports at the time and interviews that previous historians have done here at the Hampton History Museum a lot of information about the unique and illuminating way that civil rights demonstrations unfolded here in Hampton, Virginia. So talking about sort of the proper civil rights movement, what we consider the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, I wanted to talk about specifically in 1960, a series of sit-in demonstrations that were done here, again, involving Hampton Institute. So this was very important for the role of student activists in the civil rights movement. So in February of 1960, February 1st was the first Greensboro lunch counter sit-in that happened in North Carolina. And just 9 days after that, on February 10th, students at Hampton Institute organized their own sit-in inspired by and in solidarity with the Greensboro students. And these demonstrations continued for weeks and stretching into months after that, coming into local businesses like Woolworths, like pharmacies and other places with lunch counters, sitting at those and practicing nonviolent demonstrations. They would come in shifts, dozens growing into hundreds of students, asking to be served, or sometimes not even asking to be served, just sitting at the counters and then leaving when asked. So this is part of that non-violent, non-confrontational, or at least not intending to be arrested form of protest that they were practicing. And these demonstrations continued, and eventually they continued up into the next year. In 1961, they began a new wave of demonstrations that involved sitting in at theaters and local Lee Theater in Phoebus, Virginia. And that did result in arrests, and that did result in some legal litigation. And at that point, the NAACP had come in, and they had accepted support. The students had accepted support from them. They provided legal counsel. And we also see the development of different tactics. So they came to this theater then with the intention of being arrested and the intention of making a different kind of stand against segregation in public facilities. And so we see the development of student tactics and the development of student organization. At first, a lot of these protests were done with loose organization, sometimes sporadically. And then by 1961, they had formed their own student organizations, like the Students for Humanity and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had a nationwide reach and was involved here in Hampton as well. So they developed new tactics and they developed organization to help them to push for this sort of social change in their local communities.
And that's pretty significant, it seems. So developing sort of these demonstrations, do you have any idea if these sort of were able to spread at least throughout this area or throughout the country even perhaps?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Greensboro sit-ins inspired the Hampton Institute students to stage their own sit-ins, but by March, less than 2 months after the Hampton Institute students had begun their demonstrations, they actually formed their own nationwide effort to organize demonstrations. It was called Operation 26. It happened on March 26th. And this was Hampton Institute students themselves organizing together and then reaching out to other communities, mostly other colleges throughout the United States, and organizing these marches and sit-ins on the same day. So we see a lot of that that organizing and that planning and the structuring of these associations of students coming together. Not only Hampton Institute being inspired by other organizations, but Hampton Institute students then coming together and creating their own organizations, creating their own plans, and working for racial justice in their local communities as well as throughout the entire nation.
Well, you told us about two events that seem to sort of have these, not repercussions, but, quite the opposite. They've sort of moved throughout the country, some of these significant moments that you're speaking about that have happened, right here in Hampton. I did want to ask too, and I know there's so much more at the museum, but are you all doing anything, for Black History Month in particular that people can go to the museum and be a part of? I think, in general, it's a part of Hampton's history in the museum, and the history is down here. But are there any other things that you just wanted to, briefly highlight or just tell, possible visitors, what they can see, this month at the museum?
Yeah, so as far as Black history, if you're interested in learning more about Black history for Black History Month, then the museum, the Hampton History Museum, is a great place to learn about local as well as national Black history. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of events that are very significant to the Black experience in America happened here or have sort of echoes here in Hampton and throughout Hampton Roads as well. Our exhibits put a lot of that on display, and we're constantly working to update and bring more of that story, those previously unrepresented stories, into a public history context. Here at our galleries, as well as on our Facebook page and our social media, we run stories, sometimes special stories. We'll be doing one for Black History Month about particular topics related to Black history. So for quick summaries about some of those significant events here in Hampton and those broader trends throughout the United States. Here in our galleries and on our Facebook page, And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be opening another exhibit coming up later this month. That one's not about Black history, it's about Chris Craft, but still want to plug that because that's upcoming, and that'll be on display for the next year.
Absolutely. Well, Willow, thank you so much for being here today to talk about, just really just, I know, just a sliver of the history that it does exist in Hampton and in Hampton Roads. So, just from this, I do want to encourage, if people missed your comment about Aberdeen Gardens neighborhood, there is a museum in the neighborhood and historians that you can learn directly from. So I think that is a great resource for people to go directly to the source and check that out. And you can also go to the Hampton History Museum to actually, view more of the history. I'm sure that, people like you, we can go up to you and ask questions and ask you about some of the exhibits that are happening, at the Hampton History Museum, and, keep an eye on their programming. But is there anything else, Willow, that you wanted to share today in particular, or just for people to note about the preservation of history even?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, and thank you for mentioning that again, the Aberdeen Gardens Museum and the Aberdeen Gardens Historical Association, they're a great resource for learning more about that. Probably a much better one than I am, but I still want to share those stories as I can. As for regarding the student demonstrations in Hampton, you can learn more about those at the hamptonhistorymuseum.org /collection. So in our collection, we do have a series of interviews that were done with people who actually attended those protests and were a part of them. Those oral histories are available as resources as well.
And then, just in general, of people actually participating in history and learning about it and going to the museum, how essential is that? Maybe for the average person who might not have time to go to museums sometimes, but to fit it in, to make sure that you understand where you come from, to understand the culture and the background here.
Yeah, so for everybody, I think, all citizens, I think history is important for forming our own identities. We sort of get our idea of who we are as people and who we are as communities from our own history. And so we at the Hampton History Museum are doing our best to represent a lot of that and represent it as best as we can for the variety of different groups in Hampton, and us together as Hamptons and Hamptonians and citizens. And so I think for everyone, it's very important to have an idea of the history of your location. We learn a lot about national history, learn a lot about state history in school, but maybe not as much about your local area. And in some places, a quiet town, you might have some very big and very significant events happen there that are not only fun to learn about, but a great way to sort of connect yourself more with the place that you inhabit and the space and the people that you live with. Of course, I'm a little bit biased as a historian towards history, but I think it's very important for all of us in our community to learn more about that. And that's what we as public historians are here to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again to Willow. The Hampton History Museum is a great resource again, so please be sure to find out more information about your local city. Again, that also counts for, I know that, Virginia Beach does a good job keeping up with, some of their histories, and same goes with Norfolk and the other cities around here. So, be sure to find out your local resources as well. But thank you again for joining us this morning and sharing, just a brief history of some stories during Black History Month.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely.